I stood in the doorway of my own apartment, keys still warm in my hand, listening to my sister-in-law laugh like she'd just told the funniest joke in the world. "Oh, gal, what difference does it make whose square footage it is?" she said lightly, waving her hand around the living room. "My brother let us in, so it's ours now." The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because they were so casual, like ownership, effort, and boundaries were optional details, easily brushed aside. I looked past her and took in the scene. Shoes by the wall that weren't mine, a jacket thrown over the back of my chair, her kids sprawled on the couch, crumbs on the cushions. The television was on, loud, tuned to something I never watched. The apartment smelled like chujoi food, someone else's comfort, not mine. And suddenly, I felt like a guest in the place I paid for, cleaned, and came home to every day. I asked her what she meant. I tried to keep my voice steady, reasonable. She rolled her eyes and laughed again, as if I were being dramatic. She reminded me that her brother, my husband, had given them the spare key, that they'd had a disagreement with their landlord, that it was temporary. Temporary had already stretched into 3 weeks. Temporary had become drawers being used, shelves being claimed, routines being disrupted. When I turned to my husband for support, he avoided my eyes. He mumbled something about family helping family, about not making a big deal out of nothing. Nothing. That word echoed in my head. My peace was nothing. My comfort was nothing. The hours I worked to pay the mortgage were nothing. I realized in that moment how easily my needs had been downgraded once someone else wanted what I had. That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment was noisy, unfamiliar. I lay awake listening to choosy footsteps, whispered conversations, the refrigerator opening and closing. I thought about how this had started, how one small ustupka had turned into a quiet invasion. I remembered agreeing to the spare key, believing it was for emergencies. I remembered telling myself not to be selfish, and now, here I was, rehearsing arguments in my head, wondering why standing up for myself felt like betrayal. The next morning, my sister-in-law announced plans as if she owned the place. She talked about rearranging the furniture, about painting the kids' room, my kids' room. She spoke with confidence, authority, entitlement. I interrupted her and said no, just no. The room went quiet. She stared at me, shocked, then offended. She asked what my problem was. She said families don't count meters and paperwork. She said love mattered more. I told her love doesn't erase consent. Love doesn't mean taking over someone else's life. Love doesn't make you blind to boundaries. My husband tried to calm things down, telling me to lower my voice, to not embarrass anyone. That's when I understood something important. He wasn't neutral. Silence was a choice, and he had chosen comfort over fairness. I asked him directly, when we had decided that my home was a shared resource without my agreement. He said he didn't think it was a big deal. I asked him if it would be a big deal if my relatives moved in without asking him. He didn't answer. My sister-in-law scoffed and said I was making things awkward, as if the problem was my reaction, not their behavior. That afternoon, I left the apartment and walked for hours. I needed air, space, clarity. I thought about how often women are taught to be accommodating, flexible, understanding, how we're praised for sacrificing quietly and judged the moment we stop. I thought about how easily my boundaries had been dismissed because someone else's needs were louder. When I came back, I was calmer, determined. I told my husband we needed to talk, alone. I told him I couldn't live like this, that I felt erased in my own home. That compromise doesn't mean surrender. He tried to argue at first, repeating the same tired lines about family and patience. I listened, then told him something he hadn't expected. I said this apartment wasn't just walls and meters. It was my safety, my rest, my sense of self. And if he couldn't respect that, we had a bigger problem than his sister's temporary stay. I gave him a choice. Either we set clear rules and a move-out date, or I would remove myself from the situation. Not as a threat, but as self-preservation. He finally looked at me then. Really looked. For the first time, I think he understood that this wasn't about being difficult. It was about being invisible for too long. That evening, he spoke to his sister. The conversation wasn't pleasant. There were raised voices, accusations, tears. She called me controlling. She said I was tearing the family apart. But something unexpected happened. He stood his ground. He told her they needed to find another place within 2 weeks, that this wasn't their home, that letting someone in didn't mean giving everything away. The atmosphere in the apartment changed instantly, cold, tense, but also honest. For the first time since they'd arrived, the space felt like it was slowly returning to me. The 2 weeks weren't easy. There were passive-aggressive comments, slammed doors, pointed silences, but I held on. I reminded myself daily that boundaries aren't cruelty, they're clarity. When they finally left, the apartment was quiet again. Too quiet, maybe. I sat on the couch and breathed deeply, feeling the familiar weight of the space settle back into place. My husband apologized. Not perfectly, not completely, but sincerely enough to matter. He admitted he hadn't realized how much he'd taken my presence for granted. I learned something through all of this. Love without respect becomes entitlement. Help without limits becomes exploitation. And a home isn't defined by who walks through the door, but by who is heard inside it. I didn't lose my family by standing my ground. I found my voice. And that, finally, made all the difference.